Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our guests who are joining us from all over the world. I'm Professor Jane Falkingham. I'm PI of the ESRC Connecting Generations programme and Director of the ESRC Centre for Population Change. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Jennie Bristow to give this Connecting Generations Thought Leaders lecture. Jennie is a senior lecturer in sociology at Canterbury Christ Church University and an associate of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies and a writer and commentator on generational tensions and interactions. Her research focuses on generations, education and parenting culture, and her recent book, The Corona Generation, which was written with her teenage daughter during the spring and summer of 2020, explores the symbolic significance of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting lockdown policy for the generational consciousness of those coming of age in this crisis, and for the relations between adults and children. This work led her to join the editorial board of Collateral Global, a charity dedicated to cultivating a better understanding of the impact of the COVID-19 responses. Her 2019 book, Stop Mugging Grandma, is a critique of the ways in which the current generation wars, in quotes, misrepresent economic and social conflicts as conflicts between generations. So I can't think of anyone better to be talking to us today. And Jennie is here to tell us about this exciting work reflecting on the response to the pandemic via the sociology of generations. Her talk will then be followed by two members of the Connecting Generations who are forming our panel today, Professor Anne Barrington and Dr. Julia Mikolai, and they'll be on hand to discuss at the end and then also be on hand for your questions. So I'm going to hand over to Jennie now, and I hope you enjoy the next hour of lively conversation and debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thanks to everybody who's here for coming. It's a real privilege to be giving this talk today. I wanted to start first of all by just saying a few words about generations, the concept itself. What's in the concept and how should it be used? This was a title of a network that I convened with Helen Kingston from the University of Surrey with funding from the Wellcome Trust. It was a project that began in 2019 and continued through the pandemic. And the aim with this network was to bring together an interdisciplinary network of scholars and third sector organisations working with the concept of generation to really get to the heart of, what is it? So we noted that everybody seems to be talking about generations at the moment. It's become a big theme in media discussions, in policy, and there's more and more academic interest. But there's a lot of confusion about what the concept is. It's used in different ways between disciplines and even within disciplines. And, it is a very expansive concept. It has both biological and social meanings and can be used to describe family relationships, so-called vertical generations, but also peer groups and political and cultural identities. It's often used in relation to cohorts, for example, so this horizontal meaning of generations. So it's got different meanings, and increasingly people kind of identify generational differences, and this is often done in quite a divisive way, hence my interest in the so-called generation wars. So, for example, the idea, one of the things I've written a lot about is the idea that there's a conflict of interest between older and younger people over social resources, which does seem to me to be actually mixing a whole load of discussions up together. So it's sort of tempting as a sociologist in pursuit of some kind of clarity and rigour to say, oh, this is just a silly concept, let's just dump it and talk about, if we're going to talk about age, let's talk about age and not about generation and so forth. But I think that would be a shame because I think it's a very expansive concept. Burnett notes that the idea of generations has been subject to change in the flow of history and circumstance in which it's been put to work. And even though, because it's quite mutable, it's been charged with being too empty and slippery to be of much use. Yet it's these very characteristics that are a function of the survival of the concept of generations over the years and the diversity of human formation and experience, which it is named. Okay, so what do we do with this concept? With the Generations Network, we at the end of our series of discussions, we produced a policy briefing or media briefing, a very short document, which outlined 5 questions to ask yourself when you're talking about the concept of generations. What are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Where are you talking about? Why are you talking about them? And importantly, who are you talking to? And in a short while, I'll apply these questions briefly to the discussion of the COVID generation, because as I'll indicate, it has been a term that itself has become quite problematic. And yes, sorry, I'm just running a slide. And from there, I'll just develop some ideas about how a generational lens might help us to understand the pandemic. So accounting for some of the problems in which the concept of the generation has been used in relation to COVID. I also think it's got something very powerful to offer, namely that it speaks to the relationship between history and biography. That's something that C. Wright Mills outlined as a key feature of the sociological imagination. It speaks to the problem of knowledge and meaning, which was the focus of Karl Mannheim's seminal essay on the problem of generations, published, written in 1928 in the interwar period, which was really concerned with how meaning is transmitted and recreated over time, through the people as the embodiment of their historical moment. It speaks also to the problem of time. I think a lot of people, I certainly myself, have found time very difficult during COVID. I think there has been a sort of quite disorientating experience of the collapse of expected kind of transitions, milestones, boundaries, and people talk about the notion of COVID time as being something that's been very striking recently. And the concept of generations really speaks to the tension, if you like, between personal time and social time, and the fragmentation of temporality that I think has been a feature of particularly the past couple of decades. And fundamentally, generation speaks to the embodied relationship between past, present and future. So it's not just a conceptual thing. It is, when we talk about generations, we tend to be talking about people as well, which is why the generation wars is something that I've always been very uncomfortable about, because it's not just an abstract discussion, it's something that really affects people in their families and everyday lives. Okay, so just briefly to raise some of the questions about this this discussion of the so-called COVID generation. What are we talking about to begin with? The German scholars Rudolph and Zacher, in an article published in 2020, issuing a kind of a cautionary note to the discussion about generations in relation to the pandemic. They noted how generationalized rhetoric around the pandemic reproduced, quote, the various conceptual, methodological and practical problems associated with the misapplication of generations for making sense of uncertain times. And I don't want to dwell on these problems because this would take up the whole half hour, but they include long-standing difficulties in the study of generations, such as the problem of separating cohort effects from age effects from period effects, and we can maybe come back to that in the discussion. But that's an acknowledged problem with this question of when we're talking about generations, what exactly are we talking about? Because generation and age are different things. Why are we talking about generations? Why are we talking about the COVID generation? And again, here there's a bit of a problem, because a lot of the discussions over the course of the pandemic did reproduce what scholars have called generationalism. So, and this was defined by a brilliant article by Jonathan White in 2013 as the systematic appeal to the concept of generation in narrating the social and political. So it's, again, as Rudolph and Zacher says, it's about using the concept to make sense of uncertain times, but can often have a deterministic and very imprecise kind of quality. Sami Pahonen in 2016 describes generationalism as a special form of historicism by which generations are interpreted as collective actors and the succession of generations as the primary engine of history. And this kind of very positivistic idea of, you know, generations as progress or moving forward has long been a critique of, has long been critiqued within sociology as presenting a very one-sided idea about generations. And as Pahonen says, in overemphasizing the characteristics of different generations, this way of thinking results in mere caricatures between which artificial confrontations become instigated. And Bobby Duffy's talk a couple of weeks ago spoke a lot to the way in which these caricatures are constructed and why that's problematic for our understanding. But we see them often, just routinely absorbed now in the so-called generation labels that seem to be everywhere. Baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, Generation Z or Gen Z, as they're sometimes called, which when you read about these generations, there's often the implication that these aren't kind of cultural constructions. These aren't labels that society has made up to make sense of, you know, particular kind of groups of people in particular times. But it's often assumed that they actually exist, right? That they're a truth in themselves. And that's something that I think we need to question. Who are we talking about with the COVID generation? People have used the term, for everybody who was a child at the time. Where's the cutoff point? Do we say, okay, it's everyone up to the age of 16, 18, 25? Do we include the millennials? Are we just talking about Generation Z? There's been a real kind of lack of precision in that. In the sense with which I'll be kind of addressing the idea of the COVID generation, I think it makes most sense to talk about the kind of coming of age cohort round about the generation previously defined as Generation Z. That's got some problems too, but I think we should note that there's long been a search for a catchier label for Generation Z. It's really unimaginative. It comes after X and Y, and where do you go after Generation Z? So, we do need to kind of be aware of the dangers of just coming up with something that looks good. But as I'll suggest, I think there is something about coming of age in this particular moment of crisis that is worthy of attention. And even if we can agree on a definition of the COVID generation, how do we account for the diversity of experiences and outcomes within a particular cohort, say within the youth cohort? And how do we draw clear distinctions with other cohorts who also lived through the pandemic and feel shaped by it? I mean, and that's a discussion about period effects. There has been a kind of rather unfortunate discussion that tends to imply, if you're talking about, for example, young people in the pandemic, you're implying that they had just a worse time than older people, and this sort of notion that you're always talking about actual experience rather than talking about really something more ephemeral to do with meaning and to do with consciousness. Where are we talking about? The pandemic was interesting. It was obviously a global phenomenon to which different societies responded, on the one hand, in a quite a uniform way, a strikingly uniform way, through lockdown, social distancing measures and so on, but also in quite different ways as well. And so there are big questions about how generalizable ideas of the COVID generation are. One of the things that I found quite interesting was that people's actual experience of the pandemic became quite parochial. So you had travel restrictions within and between nations, and lots of legal differences about what you could do, and curfews and everything else. And even though we're seeing things from a media point of view, it was very difficult actually to know how people were experiencing things in different countries. So I think we need to really be cautious about claims of global generations in that respect. Also, the difference of experiences between people in the global north and the global south, I think, are hugely striking. And there's a danger of sort of using kind of concepts that are developed to describe experiences within the global north and just sort of applying them to the whole of the world where very different problems prevail. And importantly, there is the question of who are we talking to? White notes that when the concept of generation becomes a leading register of political discourse, as it has through the generation wars narrative, it serves as a principle of division. And this, I think, kind of takes a number of forms. Generation has become the basis of claims making about conflicts of interest between older and younger people over social resources, but also voting patterns. For example, blaming the boomers for voting for Brexit as one example. That's something that I've written about. And with COVID, I think you could see this sort of notion, blaming the younger generation for spreading COVID. This sort of really quite divisive rhetoric, which doesn't serve anybody very well. Rudolph and Zaka write about this, and they say that whilst during COVID, on the one hand, you had a sense of a kind of an ageist rhetoric, which implied that older people were less valued than younger people. But also in the discussion about young people, there was the danger of a creation of fatalism. The idea that anyone born during this time, their whole lives are going to just be shaped by the experience of the pandemic. And that this had the potential to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we need to be very aware of that. Okay, so having applied those questions, what would we see on balance about the role of the concept of generations in understanding the pandemic? I would suggest that predictions of dire outcomes for a global COVID generation, or the presentation of the pandemic response, lockdowns and so on, as something that was done to protect the old at the expense of young, really amount to simplistic determinism. And again, part of me then thinks we should maybe just ditch this concept and talk about something else instead. On the other hand, I don't think the dangers of generationalism should stop us from actually using the concept where I think it does have merit. And I think that claims that seek to strip the experience of the pandemic of its distinctive generational meaning, whether by falsely universalizing it, as in the phrase, we're all in it together, everyone's having a really bad time, or by dramatically individualizing it, saying everyone had a completely different experience, failed to acknowledge the significance of this historical moment for those coming into adulthood during this time. I would suggest, and this is my next comments just reflect this point, that the transformation of the pandemic into a generational problem represents a deepening crisis about meaning, and specifically a deepening crisis about the relationship between past, present and future. And this is a relationship that is embodied in the lived relationships that are currently most important in giving people a sense of continuity and stability. And to explain this a bit more, I want to go back to some of the insights from Mannheim's seminal essay written in the interwar period, which, 100 years ago, very different time, but also raised some very big, profound questions about the society at that time and where it was going. So Mannheim saw generations, as a concept. He explored what he called the problem of generations through a series of essays to do with the sociology of knowledge. And for him, generations really spoke to this question of knowledge, how a society understands itself and its history, and how knowledge is constructed and reconstructed over time. So society is continually engaged in this process of meaning making through the fact that generations die and are born and move on. So that was the generational contract, if you like. And by theorising the significance of generations within the transmission and development of knowledge, Mannheim's contribution provided a framework for understanding the emergence of generational consciousness in relation to wider social and cultural events. And in essence, what he said is that what we know about the world, the what, can't be decoupled from how we come to know it. Society's accumulated cultural heritage, all of our history, is not something that's just static and can just be passed down, but it's continually transmitted to and refreshed by new participants in the cultural process who make fresh contacts with our society. So people born at particular points in history embody and internalise the experience of their time, and that is necessarily distinct from those who come before them. And that's where you can have this idea of different types of generational consciousness that's developed within and informed by the experience of coming into adulthood in a particular time and place. Now, the Mannheim's theory often, you know, what he describes as social generations is often then seen as the basis for some of the labels that we're familiar with today. And I think that's kind of true, that if we think about the baby boomer generation, for example, part of that label comes from a demographic caricature of, you know, this population boom in America. Part of it is also about that notion of the 60s generation, as they're also called, you know, the young people who came of age in the 60s during this time of great social and cultural upheaval. So I think that's an important kind of element of it. But the other thing that people miss when they talk about Mannheim and social generations is that there's a tendency to emphasize differences then. So differences in outlook between, for example, the baby boom generation and so-called generations X who came after them. And the emphasis on differences misses the fact that Mannheim actually regarded the friction between older and younger generations largely as a feature of intergenerational collaboration rather than a source of intergenerational conflict. The relationship between the generations is continuous, spontaneous, and often informal. And the fact, he said, that generations are in a state of constant interaction means that they develop a sensitivity to one another. One of my favourite quotes from the essay is he says, "Not only does the teacher educate his pupil, but the pupil educates his teacher too," which is certainly something that I experience all the time whilst, yeah, in my own role as a teacher. So you don't, just because you have differences, temporal differences between different generations, doesn't mean that you end up with a constant state of warfare. In fact, it's the opposite. It becomes part of the basis for the dynamic reconstruction of knowledge. Why is coming of age important? Well, I mean, Mannheim theorised that much of what young people know about the world is absorbed unconsciously. It's the way things are. And he talked about the transmission of knowledge within the family as actually being more important than the formal transmission of knowledge through schools, you know, and education. But he suggested that as the young person matures and personal experimentation with life begins, he was quite fixated on the age of 17. We can discuss whether that is necessarily still the case today. But that notion of coming of age, that's when people develop the possibility of really questioning and reflecting on things. And this is the point at which tensions between the generations potentially come to the fore, but whether they erupt into something more significant, creating something that later theorists and commentators would often routinely discuss as a generation gap, for example. Whether these tensions erupt into something bigger depends on wider social forces operating at the time, and importantly, the interaction between the pace of social change and the cohorts coming to maturity. So a distinctive generational consciousness doesn't simply arise from the passage of time, which is often implied by the current generationalist rhetoric and narratives of the differences in, for example, the way that millennials and Generation Z use social media. You know, I mean, it's not just about going through time. Rather, it's the outcome of a social and cultural conflict when the knowledge and experience of the past comes starkly into tension with the present day. The destabilisation provoked by accelerated social change can result in a shared consciousness amongst those coming into adulthood, as young people, Mannheim said, being closer to the problems of their time, are dramatically aware of a process of destabilisation and take sides in it. And this can also result in a schism between the generations in terms of how they view the world, as the older generation cling to the reorientation that had been the drama of their youth. So conflict between the generations and the development of a distinctive generational consciousness is both the product of wider social and cultural conflict and also can contribute to it. Now, based on this, what can we say about the COVID generation, or what could we suggest at least? Well, I think we really should resist generalising claims about how the pandemic or lockdowns affected young people, because we need to account for the difference in experience. I think we should also really resist the temptation to kind of preempt what this means for what young people might think. You know, a shared generational consciousness doesn't mean that then young people kind of all come to the same view about things. This is another big misinterpretation of Mannheim. I mean, Mannheim insisted that, you know, when you have these moments, which actually Edmonds and Turner have described as traumatic events, I think it's quite a nice way of putting it, big periods of accelerated social change. He said these moments, you know, create the conditions for the emergence of an actual generation. And this is what gives the potential for a change in consciousness between the generations. But he also said within each kind of generation, there are different generation units. You know, people work up their experience in different ways, which are affected by, for example, social class and the other social divisions that surround us. OK, so even if there is a COVID generation, it's not all going to think the same thing. However, I think in terms of, is there the potential for an actual generation to emerge from this? I would suggest probably yes. I think the events of 2020 and beyond represent a new epoch that's far more significant than the expressions of social change that have previously been highlighted in the makings of a generation, really since the 1960s. I also think that there's something about the all-encompassing character of lockdowns and associated COVID-19 restrictions that gave the crisis an intimate personal quality that could not be ignored. It wasn't something that just happened. You could look at it from the media. Yeah, this was something that was ingrained into people's everyday life and their experiences. The disruption of social time and the upheaval of taken for granted ways of living and interacting gave social distancing measures a quality that impacted every dimension of life for a substantial period of time. Again, so it wasn't just a few weeks. This was, you know, really a couple of years. And this had distinctive implications for those coming of age at the point when they were really questioning things, who found that those rites of passage that had previously been considered all important stages on the path to their personal futures, whether that was exams or, you know, living independently at university, learning to drive, all of these things simply disappeared, overtaken by a cloud of anxiety about the problems of the present emergency. And in particular, the closure of schools and universities as core institutions of education and socialisation, followed by then attempts to substitute online learning of curricular content, which isn't the same thing, I think raises some profound questions about the value that our contemporary risk society, as sociologists call it, places on the transmission of the accumulated cultural heritage to the young. So I think what we have in this situation is not just an experience of young people. What we're experiencing is a wider crisis of shared meaning and a kind of lack of confidence about what to transmit to younger generations. The school closures, I mean, not the school closures themselves, but the discussions about school closures, I think really express the difficulty that adult society has in expressing the need to educate young people during a time of emergency. And I think that the social distancing that was obviously experienced very much in physical forms was accompanied by a arguably more significant sort of psychic social distancing, which I think goes alongside observable trends before the pandemic towards what I have called generational distancing. We've seen these trends in education, parenting, culture and policy, and it sort of speaks to the way in which the behaviours, conventions, wisdom, knowledge of the past is held in question, and that's been going on for some time. But I think during the pandemic that really kind of speeded up and became more stark. And this was summed up for me by the narrative that the problems presented by the pandemic and the solutions that were developed to deal with it were unprecedented. And they were unprecedented. There was nothing that we could learn from the past. In conclusion, at a symbolic level, therefore, the promotion of this moment as an unprecedented threat requiring an unprecedented response dealt a symbolic blow to the transaction between the generations. Because how can older generations pass on what they know about life, what they know about history, their experience, when everything they know is deemed irrelevant to the current state of crisis? And that is the question for me at the heart of discussions about the COVID generation, and one that will not be easily or rapidly resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a tour de force, and I'm going to have to sit and listen to it again several times because I think there was so much packed in there. That is absolutely fantastic. I'm now going to invite our panelists to join us on screen. I'm really delighted we've got two panelists today, Professor Anne Berrington and Dr. Julia Mikolai. Anne is Joint Head of Demography and Social Statistics in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Southampton, and she jointly coordinates the fertility strand of the Centre for Population Change and is also leading a strand of work in the Connecting Generations project. Julia is also a member of the Centre for Population Change and also Connecting Generations. She's a Senior Research Fellow in the Population and Health Research Group at the University of St Andrews and is currently working on the ERC Migrant Life Project, and also will be joining us very shortly on Connecting Generations work as well. So I think, Anne, we're turning to you first for comment.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you, Jenny, for your stimulating talk. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I'm just going to make 3 observations. First of all, as has been previously noted, it's often difficult to find empirical support for generational differences in attitudes. And here we have the example of attitudes to climate change using data from the British Attitude Survey. And we see that actually there is not as much difference in generational attitudes to climate emergency as might be expected, given the rhetoric about sort of climate wars. So, you know, over 90% of all the cohorts believe that climate change is definitely or probably happening. That said, a third of the millennials were very or extremely worried about climate change, as compared with just a fifth of the baby boomer / silent generation. So sometimes the differences aren't as large as we might think. Sometimes the differences between cohorts in their attitudes are extremely large, as is the case of family formation attitudes here, but they don't really follow a nice generational narrative, particularly using the definitions of generation that we tend to see, so colour-coded here, from the greatest generation through to Gen X. So I've just put up some data, which is from a paper I wrote about a decade ago, but it demonstrates this very nicely, I think. So for each of those age groups, we've got data from 3 rounds of the British Social Attitude Survey, 84, 95 and 2006. So each column represents the percentage who said that premarital sexual relations are not at all wrong, so are positive about premarital sex. So in 1984, 17% of the greatest generation said that premarital sex was not at all wrong, rising to 68% amongst the baby boom generation. And we can use a quasi-cohort approach to follow these cohorts over time, such that they age in 10 years' time. And we can follow the diagonal, so follow the colour coding to follow the cohorts as they age. And we can see that within the cohorts, within the colours, cohorts in this attitude don't change very much in their attitude. So not much of an ageing effect that Jenny mentioned earlier. But there are these very large cohort differences. So if we look across the road, we can see, for example, if we look at age group 40 to 50, only 44% of the silent generation approved of premarital sex, compared to 59% of the early baby boomers, those born 45 to 55, and 73% of the late baby boomers, that is, people born in 56 to 66. So, in brief, we see here that there's more of a continuous change in attitude across cohorts rather than following a distinctive generational breaks. and also that within a big generation like the baby boom generation, there are important differences between those born immediately post-war and those born slightly later, and I'm happy to talk about why that might be later on. But let me move on. The next point I want to make is about data sources, because we do have some potentially rich sources of data for studying the scarring effects that Jennie talked about. So these missed milestones and these disrupted educations. And some of you are probably aware, for example, of the ESRC funded COSMO study, which has started, which has following up a large representative cohort of young people who were in year 11 in the academic year 2020 to 2021. So far, 2 waves have been planned and funded. And so these sorts of data, along with understanding society and the Millennium Cohort, will be able to provide some evidence of the sort that we could start to address some of the important questions that Jennie's put forward. I was reflecting, and Jennie and I talked about this earlier today, about Mannheim's age 17 as the age of coming of age. And of course, what we've seen over recent decades is the extension in the transition in the time of transition to adulthood. It's diversification and extension. So I did wonder whether 24 is now the new age 17. And the final point I want to make, if I've got time with 2 very brief examples, is that it might actually be quite difficult, even if we have reasonably good data, to isolate the effect of COVID on young people's transitions to adulthood, because we've had a lot of change in those transitions over past decades. So that might be change in residential independence. So here we see that the percentages living with their parents have increased dramatically over the past 2 decades. And so COVID might just accentuate that change. And then as another example, teenage and young fertility. Parenthood is being delayed. It was already being delayed quite markedly. So teenage fertility rates have halved over the last decade. So it's going to be quite difficult to sort of see what further impact COVID and other changes like Brexit and the housing market and economic insecurity are having on that. But I look forward to trying to grapple some of these questions.
Thank you very much, and just to remind everyone who's joining us online, you can post your questions in Slido. It's coming up on my other screen, so I will be looking to the left or the right, depending on how it comes up a little bit later. But I'm now going to turn to Julia for her comments.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jennie, very much for the really inspiring talk. And I agree with both Jane and Anne that there is lots to digest. And I will also probably re-listen, although I was taking notes, to better be able to digest what you were saying. And Anne, also thank you very much for the important points you have raised, and you have mainly focused on young adults. And in my section, I would like to focus on the experiences of children during the pandemic. And in what follows, I will highlight research by members of the Interdisciplinary Child Wellbeing Network. We call it ICWBN for short, which is an interdisciplinary network of both academics and practitioners from the UK and Ireland who have studied the economic and social impacts of the pandemic on children in these 2 countries. The network is co-led by myself and Kat Chen at Trinity College Dublin. And I wanted to mention that the project was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the Irish Research Council under the UK-Ireland Networking Grant Scheme. Okay, so although children's physical health may have been less directly affected by the pandemic than that of adults, actually the indirect consequences of the pandemic for children's lives are potentially wide-ranging and also potentially long-lasting. The network has focused on 3 key areas of child well-being, these being economic well-being, educational outcomes, and mental health of children. And in what follows, I'm going to show you some of the key findings on each of these 3 areas. So first, regarding the impact of the pandemic on children's economic well-being, I wanted to highlight results from the COVID-19 survey of the Growing Up in Ireland study, which followed children born in 1998 and 2008. This graph shows the percentage of parents of 12 and 22-year-old children. In blue, we have the parents of 12-year-old children, and in orange, the parents of 22-year-old children. And we see the percentage of those parents who have reported that it was easy or very easy to make ends meet among high and low income households. And you see the high income households on the left, low-income households on the right. So what we see on this graph is that more than half of high-income parents of 12-year-olds found it easy or very easy to make ends meet, but among the poorest households, only 14% reported this. And among parents of the older children in the orange bars, the trends were similar. So overall, we can conclude that the pandemic has led to greater financial difficulties among lower income families. Next, regarding the impact of the pandemic on children's education, I show the results of a study carried out by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and they have used their own data on over 11,000 parents to study the trends in average weekly learning time among primary and secondary school children over the course of the pandemic. So on the left, you see primary school children, and on the right, secondary school children. And we see the change over time if you look at the three bars. The dark blue bars show pre-pandemic average learning time. The green bar shows the first school closures period, and the yellow the second school closure period. So what we see is that before the pandemic, average weekly learning time was around 35 hours for both primary and secondary school children. But then during the first school closure, this has declined to just 22 hours for both groups of children. We do see a slight recovery during the second period of school closures, where children spent on average 27 to 29 hours a week on learning. So overall, the pandemic has led to reduced learning time among school children. And I should mention here quickly that others have shown that there are socioeconomic inequalities also in experiences of learning. And finally, regarding mental health, I wanted to show the results of the co-space study that followed the mental health of 9,000 children during the pandemic. They studied behavioral, emotional, and attentional difficulties. These are shown in the three columns of this graph in this order. And they have looked at these behaviors in children overall, which is shown by the black line that is towards the bottom of each of the graphs. But then also looked at heterogeneity among children by, for example, looking at the experience of children from low income. This is shown by the pink line, comparing the experiences of primary and secondary school children. Here you can look at the yellow and blue lines, and also studying the experiences of children with special educational needs. And these are the top lines, this dark green, grayish color. And what is plotted on this graph are values of so-called SDQ scores. These come from the so-called strengths and difficulties questionnaire, where for each of these domains of children's behavior, a set of questions are presented to parents, and then they evaluate how typical this kind of behavior is for their child. And on this scale, higher values indicate worse outcomes. So basically the lines that are higher up are worse experiences among children than the lines that are lower down. So I'm sorry, this was a bit complicated to explain this graph, but then overall what we see from here is that the pandemic has led to increased behavioral, emotional, and attentional difficulties for children overall. You can see that there is always an increasing scores during periods of lockdown if you look at the overall black line. But we also see that there is this heterogeneity indeed. So, for example, children from lower income families, look at the pink line, have done worse in terms of their mental health, and especially those who have special educational needs. We can see that the green line is always on the top. And there were also differences between children who were younger or older. So here compare the yellow to the blue lines. So to conclude, the pandemic has led to increased mental health difficulties in children. To summarize, we showed that the pandemic has led to worse economic and mental well-being, as well as educational outcomes among children, and has highlighted striking socioeconomic inequalities in children's experiences. But it remains to be seen whether the impact of the pandemic was temporary or long-lasting, and whether indeed we can and need to talk about a COVID generation. Finally, I wanted to leave you with some advertisements. If you would like to know more about our network and the research that we have carried out, please check out our podcast series called Generation Pandemic, which is available on all streaming services, and read the CPC policy briefing that we have published. And to follow our work or get in touch, please check out our website or Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Anne. I'm going to, I have in the programme 4 minutes to respond, but I'm actually going to give my 4 minutes over to Jenny, so she can just respond very briefly to Anne and Julia, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience, which are coming in through Slido thick and fast at the moment. Just remind people you can actually upvote the questions that you feel most important or appeal to you. So please do vote for your questions as well. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to be voting while Jenny responds to Anne and Julia.
Okay, well, no, thank you both. I think, yes, first of all on Julia, Julia's point, one of the most disturbing things about this sort of generationalized rhetoric around things is that it does miss stuff or represent stuff that is really important. So, for example, children with low incomes. Yeah, I mean, that was the story actually of the inequality in the pandemic, the big one. It was, you know, lockdowns protected the middle classes and the wealthy at the expense of others, and yet that discussion often gets hidden in these. So I'm really pleased to see that you've brought out the different the other divisions that come into these impacts on children. In relation to Anne, yeah, 17 versus 24. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, again, one of the things that was happening pre-pandemic, but I thought that the pandemic really brought to a fore was the collapse of, not maybe collapse is a bit strong, but the real blurring of the boundaries between adults and children. You know, people have talked about this for a long time in terms of extended adolescence and all of that. And we do seem to have, I think, a simultaneous infantilization of young adults and also an adultification of them. I mean, you see that happening in the discussion about universities. On the one hand, universities are supposed to treat, you know, students as little children. On the other hand, they're charged with having to spend all this money and become active consumers and everything else. And I think I think it's a wider problem, but I think during the pandemic, you did have a very strange thing going on when, yeah, essentially we all became reduced to children, really. Anyone trying to parent during this time, yeah, it's like, you know, that normally the question of what time should you be in, who should you go out with, how many people can you be with, yeah, that's what you do. Whereas actually we were all kind of trying to follow the rules, these rules that were sort of set down. And you did have a real sense of, the questions of adult responsibility and authority, I think, became very confused, and trying to kind of unwind from that position, I think, is going to be very difficult going forwards.
Great, thanks. So questions are coming in and voting is taking place. The first one coming through is from Phil Cohen, who is the research director of Living Maps Network. To what extent do you think that the pandemic has accelerated the shift to an asset rather than income-based platform, reshaping the generational contract around the grid of inheritance in transmitting competitive disadvantage or advantage? That's quite a complicated question there about the shift from assets to incomes, pandemic accelerating that, and inheritance. Happy for anyone on the panel to take that, but Jenny, do you want to have a go first?
Yes, I'll try and do it briefly. I think it has done that, but I think that this is an economic shift that's happening, right? This is the new equality. I mean, people have written about this so-called neo-feudalism, all of that. The social contract is different, right? And so there are these big economic shifts happening. We're having the concentration of wealth at the top and around land, you know, in a very small, number of people. And the kind of questions about wage equality and progression and everything have become more complex. So I think that is happening. What disturbs me is that when people sort of take that insight and then kind of plonk it onto people, for example, in the argument that, well, that's because all these baby boomers have big houses and they should give them to their kids, which to me seems to be a classic example of using, it's generationalism, you know, it's kind of trying to discuss a big macro problem through then the experiences of people in society. And, you know, we should realise, I mean, the baby boomers, for example, if they have got a lot of money tied up in their property, you know, maybe, yeah, that's luck or whatever. They didn't set out to do that. There's no boomer conspiracy that went on. And also there are a lot of people within the baby boomer cohort that don't have large numbers of assets and everything else. And I just really worry that those people are just being kind of vilified without looking at the more nuanced issues.
Great, thank you for that. Another question that's coming from Professor Priscilla Alderson, who says, thank you for a great session. And she asks, do coming of age and then becoming insightful, so these concepts of becoming of age and becoming insightful, underestimate young children's lives and deep thinking? So rather than 17, it's maybe moving down to 9.
Well, I would repose it the other way around, really, and to sort of say, if we overemphasize what children do in making sense of their lives, which of course they do, you know, and yeah, they develop and everything else, then we miss actually what is significant about coming into adulthood. So again, we do risk blurring the boundaries too much. I think the point about coming into adulthood at whatever age you do it, and it's always been arbitrary, right? I mean, this is all the discussions that have ever happened about the age at which young people can drink, drive, you know, smoke, all of these things. Everyone recognises that 2 18-year-olds are not the same, but there's a important social issue to do with making that leap into being an adult and what that means. And when you're an adult, you have a greater degree of responsibility for your own life, but importantly, you have a lot of responsibility for the dependents, I mean, for children. And I think one of the things that I find kind of quite disturbing at the moment is that there does seem to be a kind of reluctance to not make that leap, but to kind of have a positive narrative around it. You know, so I'll be interested in Anne's thoughts on this in relation to discussions around fertility. I hear a lot of the time young people going, well, gosh, I can't imagine, you know, this notion of adulting. Well, I don't mind adulting for a day, but I can't imagine why you'd want to take, you know, all the expense and responsibility and all of that on board. And so I think we've got a very sort of confused idea about adulthood right now.
And picking up on parenting, adulting and I presume adulting and parenting.
Well, yeah, it's a huge question, isn't it? I mean, I think, first of all, that Jenny, you're talking about quite a number of different sort of transitions that typically take place at different ages. So yes, sort of drinking at 18, but, you know, the average age at sort of motherhood is more like sort of entry into motherhood is more like 30. So there's even a big gap between that. And as I said before, there have been these decadal changes in terms of, you know, the impact of, you know, women's education, women's employment, men's employment, men's education, the housing crisis, economic insecurity on the delay in childbearing and the recent decline over the past decade. And so it's very difficult to know what additional impact COVID will have.
And I think we've segued very nicely into Paul Bridgen's question, and Paul, perhaps we've already half answered it. Paul asks, how important in the development of COVID generational consciousness do you think preceding events that also highlighted intergenerational tensions such as austerity, climate change, Brexit, voting patterns, etc. Play a role? And he says, I'm asking as an academic and a parent of very generationally conscious 19 and 21-year-olds.
Okay, yeah, you have my sympathy. I think there are two things going on here. I mean, I think that there's the generational consciousness itself and what that might mean, and what I was trying to emphasize when talking about the significance of COVID and the lockdowns is that it didn't just happen. It wasn't just that. It's more that this seems to me to be a moment where things, you know, history is shifting like massively, and this doesn't happen all the time. You know, I mean, obviously you're all history's always going on, but there are moments where things really seem to speed up and old certainties get turned on their heads and everything else. And I think the fact that the lockdowns happen in the context of a lot of other tensions arising is what makes this a particular moment. I think your generationally conscious children. I mean, I think there's something else that goes on, which was the basis of the critique of my previous work, which is the absorbing kind of generation ideas about what it means to be Generation Z or a millennial or whatever into a kind of a form of identity politics, which I think can become then very dangerous, because you end up with this idea of, you know, society is a battle of young versus old, which misses a lot of the wider issues around it. And it's also, I mean, it's a no-go area, right? I mean, young people do not stay young forever. I mean, if you look at the way that the millennials are now discussed compared to, say, when the EU referendum happened, the millennials have gone from being kind of the objects of great pity and, oh dear, you know, these young people, the vote didn't go their way, to now the millennials are often discussed as, well, you know, they're getting on a bit, they had all the advantages. Oh, what about poor little Generation Z? And so we can end up creating this real sense of kind of age-based grievance and setting groups in society against each other, which is the last thing that we need to do at the moment.
Brilliant. There are two more questions, Jenny, and I'm going to ask both of them, and then you can choose which or both you answer in the final 4 minutes. One is actually related to Generation Z. It's from Lucy Suka, who's Director of Research at Youthscape, and she asks, are there any clearly evidenced characteristics of Generation Z? So is there something that makes Generation Z stand out? And from Harold Caswell, Professor Harold Caswell in the Netherlands, he's asking, what do you say to the argument that the biggest effect of COVID was on the elderly?
Okay. As a disease, I mean, if COVID were conscious, which it wasn't, right, because it was a virus, you know, you would say it's the biggest kind of perpetrator of age discrimination that has ever existed. You know, the people who were massively more at risk from COVID, the disease, were older people, and it was extraordinary in that regard. And what we as a society needed to have done was to marshal all our resources in protecting those older people. And I don't think we did that. I mean, this is an ongoing debate, right? But I don't think we did that. I think that what then happened was that older people, were very vulnerable to the virus. Also, were terrified by the campaigning. I mean, the idea that this was all kind of done to protect old people. I mean, you know, and people have said, a lot of people I've talked to have said, the two groups in society that really suffered were those who had actually very few years left to live. You know, so you spend, you know, you're in your 90s and you spend that period being absolutely terrified and completely isolated. And then the young groups who also lost a lot during that time, because, you know, 2 years in a young person's life is a really, really long period of time in which quite a lot of stuff happens. Whereas if you're middle-aged, you know, like me, you know, 2 years is, well, you know, nothing. I mean, you can't even remember how old you are half the time. So I think there's that's why I think that it's a real mistake to see it as some kind of generation war, and why I keep trying to emphasize that when I'm talking about the generation experience, I'm not trying to make broad pronouncements about people's experience. You know, I know young people who actually quite like lockdown, and I know young people who really hated it. Young people who struggled, young people who did probably better than they would have done otherwise. You know, so it's not about experience, it's about the meaning that we as a collective society attribute to it and derive from it.
Brilliant.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Generation Z?
Right. Again, I think the problem with so much discussion about generations is that it tries to it takes their voice from them. I mean, Generation Z are still very, very young. You know, they will, if they develop a particular form of generational consciousness and different types within it, they will make that heard, they will make that known. I think there's a tendency with our obsession with generations, we tend to just sort of try and preempt it and second guess it and go, oh, this is what they think. And if you look at a lot of discussions about young people in general, it's actually older people just saying what they think young people should think and putting it into the mouths of babes. So that's why I tend to back off from that question. I think, you know, if we care about young people, if we understand that the importance to the continuation and development of our society, we've got to let them have their own voice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. So thank you so much for contributing to our Thought Leader series this year. It's really great to have the really in-depth sociological lens shone onto the concept of generations, and we'll be picking the thread up again in the autumn when we have Professor Maria Grasso from Queen Mary's, London, who's coming to talk to us about politics and generations. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe, and I hope everybody's managed to get through this without being too hot. But thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jenny, in particular. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Anne. Thanks, everyone.